But thank you for that introduction. I'm David Campbell. I am a botanist, ecologist, and wetland delineator. I currently work for a company called HARP, which is Habitat Assessment and Restoration Professionals. We're based out of Charlotte. We do a lot of different things, but the main thing that I do is threatened endangered species surveys, which of course dovetailed nicely into this present study that we're talking about today. So if anybody has questions as I go along, by all means, please raise your hand. It's informal and all that sort of thing. So I'm going to try to advance the slides here the old-fashioned way if I can. Okay, so a lot of people ask, and I guess quite rightly and sensibly, why do we need to do a Polk County bioinventory? So in North Carolina, we've got 100 counties, and each of them almost at this point has had, what happened?
Disappeared. TV turned off. The TV turned.
Well, goodness.
It said it was going to. Yes.
Oh, did it?
Yep.
How does one turn the TV on again?
But that looks like a remote over here.
I know there was, this young lady here helped us set it up, so every setup's different, so I just let people do that. Okay, cool. Will it just kind of be good that way? Thank you, thank you, thank you. Anyway, back to what we were saying, right? Got to have some technical glitch. That's just how it always is. So yes, 100 counties in North Carolina, and not all of them have been subjected to a bioinventory yet, but almost all of them have been. And there have been studies, like Polk County has a very long history of botanical study, going back to the latter part of the 19th century with people like Townsend, Donald Culross Peattie, Freeman, and so on. There was a report done in the mid to early 90s on the Pacolet area by Dr. Rayner of South Carolina, who's a very competent botanist. But Polk County is sort of seen as a bit of a jewel in the crown by botanists throughout North Carolina and this region in general because it's so biodiverse, even though it's, I believe, one of the 5 smallest counties we have in our state. Because we have such interesting elevational changes, rainfall patterns, sort of temperature regime, and a lot of different rocks that weather to form different soils with different pHs and so on. Polk County has been, I guess, uniquely blessed with a high level of biodiversity. So it just seemed like it was about time that this place should get the attention it deserved. So that was sort of the rationale. And then once the report is done, again, as you can read, provides important baseline data for land managers. So for example, if you don't know what you have, you can't manage it, you can't protect it, and so on, right? Generates critical and timely data for federal and state at-risk species. So a lot of this data that's been generated is passed on to the Natural Heritage Program in Raleigh, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as well, because we have federally endangered species here as well as state threatened and endangered species. So all of this data has to sort of go into the system so people can make appropriate decisions. And again, it brings us in line with all the other counties that have had their sort of surveys done. Okay. So how did we do it? I did a lot of reading. Some of this reading actually, again, going back to the 1920s, Donald Culross Peattie, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he was affiliated with the Tryon Garden Club. I believe he was originally from Ithaca, New York, or that region, and his parents, I think, moved down here. We're talking 1920s, that time period. And he would sort of come down and visit them. And while he was sort of hanging out here, and he was an author of some note in the early part of the 20th century, he would collect and do stuff. And I mean, I made good use of some of his herbarium specimens that are housed at Chapel Hill. Gave me some sort of insight into places to look for rare things, and actually I relocated a few of those things. So it just goes to show you, you never know, where this data will come from. So a lot of reading, looking at specimens, database with Heritage Program, talking to other folks who've been active in the region, and then of course reaching out to landowners. And some of you may be familiar with the Polk County's Most Wanted articles in the newspapers that myself and Pam back there have been writing for, I guess, 7-ish years, one a month or so, given what's going on. But we've had a lot of positive feedback from these newspaper articles. Now, not everybody finds what we're looking for, but I think we've captured a good percentage of things, captured our most wanted. But even if folks reach out and they say, well, I've got such and such a species, I might go out there and they've misidentified it, but I'll find something else at school almost invariably. So without landowner buy-in, this wouldn't have been nearly as productive. And there's an example of Polk County's Most Wanted with Indian paintbrush. That photo is by Keith Bradley, not myself. But, again, it's kind of funny. I was in Hickory somewhere, and this lady came up to me and said, hey, you really need to read these articles. It's Polk County's Most Wanted. These are really cool articles. I said, well, are they? Like, I wanted to hear what she had to say. And then she said, yeah, my grandmother collects them all. And I said, oh, wow, I write them. Along with Pam. Pam also has written some, but that's my only 15 minutes of fame I'm ever getting in this world, but I'll take it, right? So what did we do here? This is sort of the PowerPoint kind of shorthand, right? So we selected a bunch of sites, and we visited them. And, some were better than others. Maybe I might find one rare plant or two at a certain site, but the site itself maybe didn't have the integrity to be considered a really quality site. So we'd keep that data, pass it on anyway. But after we sort of sifted through the sites, so to speak, we eventually sort of, distilled it down to the best sites. And yes, it was hundreds of hours, probably way more than that. But it was good. Labor of love, right? So what did we find? We found one species of vascular plant completely new to science. And I will talk about what that is near the end of the program here. Hundreds of new county records of vascular plants. And when I say vascular plant, I guess you're all master gardener people, right? So I'm talking about things that aren't mosses and liverworts, right? What we consider to be plants. A lot of state records for at-risk species. Lots of herbarium specimens vouchered and sent to UNC Chapel Hill or UNC Charlotte. Those are the places I deposit my specimens typically. So lots of good data generated. And more. So we have over 140 rare and watch-listed vascular plants in Polk County. Now you might be like, okay, that sounds cool, I guess. Well, Rutherford County has maybe 70. It's way bigger. This gives you, lots of rare animal species as well. A lot of these inventories are of necessity heavily weighted towards plants because they don't move and you can find them. But animals kind of matter, don't they? And obviously. And so we tried to kind of put as much of that faunal information into the report as we could, as well as floral. We found many community types here. And so community types are assemblages of plants, typically, that can be identified repeating in the landscape. You have certain plants you see together, they form these community types. And I think in North Carolina now we have something like over 400 recognized community types. And so these are becoming of greater interest to scientists collectively. So, time to get to the cool stuff, right? The pictures of the flowers, anybody know what that is?
Lady slipper.
What kind though?
Orchid.
Oh yes, it's an orchid. But what kind of lady slipper? Does anybody know?
Yellow.
It's yellow. Yeah, yellow. Yeah. So orchid, right? Everybody loves orchids. They're rare, and actually there's many species of orchids in the world. I don't know if I'm right about this, but it could be even 60,000 or something. It's one of the biggest vascular plant families. A friend of mine who grows orchids said, well, orchids aren't hard to grow if you give them everything they need. And it's if, the little word with the big meaning, right? Does anybody know what the word orchid, what it means? There's no little children here, so I can say this, right? Orchid is from the Greek word archedia, which means testicle. So think about that the next time someone gives you corsage or something. It's an allusion to the root, apparently, of an orchid that somebody with a fanciful imagination. But now you know. I know you always wanted to know, but now you know. All right, so we'll start. This is an interesting plant for a number of reasons. It's one of our earliest flowering plants, maybe late February, early March. And you may notice that it has nothing green on it. Right? If you're familiar with the white Indian pipe plant that grows in our woods, this is a plant that doesn't photosynthesize. It's a saprophyte. It's got fungal partners and feeds on dead things in concert with the fungi and whatnot. This particular one is what we call a southern Appalachian endemic, more or less. It's only found in our region. I think it may extend up into Maryland. I could be wrong. But when I find this thing, perhaps you can sort of see the pine needles in the background. I always find it growing in association with some pine and usually mountain laurel, so it likes very acidic soil. So in our county, Polk County has a lot of sort of baser-rich soils, mafic soils. So when we look for this, it's more to the east near the Rutherford County line where soils seem to be more acidic. And the way I find this thing is I smell it. because you can't really see it very much. It barely pokes up above the pine needle duff, and it smells like cloves. I don't know if anyone here has seen or smelt this plant, but it's a federal species of concern. It's a plant that's rare, but to some degree I kind of think maybe the rarity is a bit of an artifact of the fact it's so cryptic and hard to find. And so the only times I ever find it, I need my nose first and my eyes second, and half the time my nose doesn't help because I can't find it anyway. It's like a ventriloquial smell. I can't put it any other way. You know it's there, you know you're near it, and you probably won't find it. But
How small is it? Real teeny? Or
it's basically, when it starts popping out of the leaf litter, if you like, it's kind of about maybe the size of your thumb. It's sort of a little bit bent down. And, but as it progresses through the season and it gets pollinated, it will elongate and sort of straighten up a bit. And so one of the ways I found to find this is to follow bumblebees. And I remember being in Catawba County, and I could smell it. I was in the perfect habitat, and I'm like, I know it's here, my goodness, right? And I saw a queen bumblebee, because in the early spring, the only bumblebees around are queens, right? They hibernate, start new colonies, and I thought, I'll follow her. And as soon as there they were, and there was hundreds of the plants. And I was only about from my distance to you. And suddenly, they were there. And nobody had really documented what pollinated these before that, but in the very early spring, there's not a lot of things out and about. It's usually bumblebees, maybe flies, some beetles. But it was kind of neat. It was one way to find it, but it's not a big plant. It might get 3-4 inches max by the end of it all. And it's interesting, when you press it on a herbarium sheet, even years later, it's got sort of a purple, sort of a stem. You can still smell it years later. It's a very interesting plant. And perhaps if you look at the flowers, you can sort of see the relationship with the blueberries. It's part of that family, the Ericaceae, the heath family. So this is kind of one of our special things from around here. You guys should know this one, right? Dicentra. I think the one we use in our gardens is Dicentra spectabilis. I think that's the Asian species. This is our native one, Dicentra eximia. It's much commoner west of the Blue Ridge in limestone regions like Tennessee. Here not so much, but I found this on some large boulders in the North Pacolet River Valley on what we call mafic rocks, and they weather to form a more base-rich soil, a richer situation. And these are also typically pollinated by bumblebees. Wild ginger, this is a neat one. I don't know if you're familiar with it. I've just sort of deposited the flower on the leaf. And again, that's maybe about 1 inch across, 1.5 inches. That is a very, if you look at the structure, those elongated structures, that's not typical for what most wild gingers in our area look like. And so some authorities consider that there's only one type of deciduous wild ginger in eastern North America, but there's really 3. And from what I can tell, this is the rarest of the 3. And this is also North Pacolet River Valley, which again is such an awesome place for spring wildflowers, as you may know. This actually isn't really a ginger. If you break it, it smells like a ginger, but it's in a completely different family of plants. It's in the same family as Dutchman's pipe, if you know that vine that sort of grows up with big heart-shaped leaves. It's in the Aristolochiaceae family, birthwort family. But actually, what was interesting about this is, I think this was one of the first times we verified this plant from North Carolina. And I remember sending, I had a bag of fresh ones, and I FedExed them to Alan Weekly at UNC Chapel Hill, and he's sort of the guru of botany here. And he sort of got on the phone, he's like, whoa, what's this? Like he had never seen it before, so it was kind of a Christmas Day moment for him, I guess. So, yes, question?
You mentioned that you put the flower on top. Typically, the flower's underneath.
Yes, ma'am.
Right?
That is correct. Yes, thank you for pointing that out. It's normally below, so I just sort of broke it off and put it on top. So if you can imagine that thing below the leaves, it's at ground level, pollinated by small flies or ants. It's not a sort of wow in your face plant, but maybe if you're a tiny bug it is. But the first time I cast eyes on this flower, I was like, wait a minute. It looks a lot like some that you get out west in the western portions of the continent. Here's another orchid, large whorled begonia, Isotria verticillata. This is the more common of the two. This prefers piney acidic woods. Often you'll see it with pink lady slipper orchids maybe. It's not common, but the small whorled begonia is much rarer. And that has been found at Chimney Rock Park. And I suspect it's probably somewhere in eastern Polk County, but I've not seen it. This flowers in April. And it's another one that's cryptic. It's like, once you see it, you're like, whoa, but it doesn't sort of stand out at you. But when you see a number of them together, they're pretty interesting looking, as you can probably tell. It's kind of unusual looking. Appalachian golden banner, you can maybe see the flowers that's in the pea family. Thermopsis mollis. This is one that likes acidic soils as well, piney areas. Maybe areas that burn from time to time with soils that aren't very rich. It's like a yellow lupine. I think, I don't know if you're familiar with Plant Delight's nursery in Raleigh. Do some of you know where that is? They refer to this as red-necked lupine. So, it's not politically correct, but whatever. It's a very cool plant. How about that? And there's a white species. I like this one because I like the contrast of the white petals with the gray sort of stalk there. This one likes more base-rich soils, this particular one. But both of them, when you collect them and press them, they turn black. All the baptisias turn black. The indigos, maybe they were utilized in dye, of course, back in the day. This you guys have probably seen around, right? These trilliums that sort of have their petals, if you like, in the middle, they're sessile. That's the fancy botanical word for like no stem. They're right tight to the leaf. The other kinds of trilliums that sort of come up are called pedicellate. They have a pedicel. But you'll see these sort of things along, stream-side flats. These also like rich soil. Not super rare, but again, I think they're being commercially exploited a bit, dug up often. But they do make a pretty good garden plant if you can provide them with what they need. There are a number of species of Trillium that superficially resemble this, sort of in the southern Appalachian region. Some new ones are being described depending on how you want to slice and dice. But this is the commonest of the sessile trilliums in our area. Sometimes they become yellow. There's a different species or two that's yellow, but some of these actually also come yellow.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
I've just come from Wisconsin.
Very good.
All our trillium are creamy colored.
Okay.
So hiking the other day, or maybe, I don't know, a couple weeks ago, I saw my first maroon colored one.
Okay.
And I was just blown away.
Yeah.
It's like, so do you get the creamy white ones here, or is it maybe?
Do you mean looking like this with the flower right to the stem?
Yeah, and the maroon, the maroon.
Yeah, there's yellow ones. There's Trillium luteum that's kind of up in the limestone areas of our mountainous region and to the east. There's one a bit to the west of us called Trillium discolor that's sort of more of a custard yellow. There's a number of different species, and sometimes you'll even see almost what appears to be an intergradation of colors, like there's been some kind of mix-up. But the flowers don't read the book. Sometimes they just do what they do. I remember one time, I think you were with me, Pam, and we were at the Childers Tract, and there was like a whole hillside of these, and like right in the middle is like a yellow one. Just like saying, hey, I'm going to be yellow, everybody. That's just the genetic roll of the dice, I guess. So this is Spiderwort Tradescantia virginiana. This is one of the rarer spiderworts. Perhaps, you can sort of see that might remind you of some of the like houseplants, like Wandering Jew, I think it is in this family. It's not a very nice name for a plant, I guess, but nonetheless, there you go. But this is one of our rarer ones. And this was along the Green River, not too far from where we're all congregated right now. So here's a pedicellate trillium. So you can see that they're not stuck right on where the leaf is, but they have a little stem or a pedicel for the flower. And this one, sweet white trillium, actually does have a scent. It's kind of, it's not very pungent, but in the North Pacolet River Valley, where there's like lots of them, you can actually occasionally smell it as it wafts up, and it's like amazing. This particular one, Trillium simile, if you look at the petals, I always say they kind of look like they're coming out at you. They're not flat out, but they're coming out. But the diagnostic feature is this dark ovary, because sometimes there's red trilliums that look like this that can come white, but they're not this one because they don't have a dark ovary. So, sometimes you got to look just to be sure. But a friend of mine who's a Trillium expert, I brought him into the North Pacolet River Valley to see these, and he was, blown away. And this could be one of the world's, for sure it's got to be one of the world's largest populations of this plant. And this is not a common plant. It's just in our sort of region, the southern Appalachian region, couple, 3 states. So it's a beautiful, beautiful Trillium. Monk's hood, right? Very poisonous plant, by the way. I don't know if you know that. They mention it in Harry Potter for what it's worth, right? Severus Snape calls it aconite. But there's some species in this genus or this family that grow in the Pacific Northwest that are so toxic that native people could literally, and I'm not making this up, would tip their spears with this stuff and they could kill whales with it. And so, yeah, Google that for real. Just check it out. But I guess it's in the buttercup family, the Ranunculaceae. And I guess if you look at it from a certain angle, maybe if you've had a couple of drinks, I don't know, it looks kind of like the cowl of a monk's hood. There's also a rarer color variant, a different species called Aconitum reclinatum, or trailing wolfsbane, that is quite rare, that has been found in the vicinity of like a wildcat spur up in this sort of northwestern corner of the county. Both of them are very poisonous. Trillium flexipes. So what do you notice about the ovary on this one? It's not dark. And it's a little bit more kind of on a flatter plane. It's not coming out at you. But this particular Trillium, we rediscovered in North Carolina. It hadn't been reported for several decades. There were old records from the 50s and whatnot. But we rediscovered this, and it was pretty exciting. This particular Trillium grows even up into the Great Lakes region, but it sort of has a spotty distribution. So it was kind of exciting to rediscover it again in our state. Likes rich woods like all the Trilliums seem to do for the most part. Here's sweet white Trillium in a rose-colored variant, just as you were saying about colors. So again, sometimes you can see the dark ovary, the kind of 3D in your face petals, but from time to time, this isn't an artifact of the plant's health or age. It's fresh flower, just occasionally you'll get a different variant. Here's a funky picture of nodding Trillium, so I had to kind of get under the leaf, as you can kind of see. So if you look down from above, you'll just see the leaves often, and you have to kind of look under to see the nodding flower. This one I always find in association with spicebush, if you're familiar with that shrub. Spicebush to me is a good plant that's obvious, that's a cue to look for other rare stuff sometimes, because spicebush likes rich soil, and this plant needs rich soil too. It's one of our more uncommon Trilliums. I think I have another picture of it somewhere, maybe, or maybe not, I don't know. This is not a very exciting looking thing, maybe. It's Midwestern carrion flower, if you know what catbriers are, smilax. But this is interesting because in our region, as the name sort of suggests, Midwestern carrion flower, it's really not something that's common in this part of the world. And so Polk County is known for having coastal plain plants that are disjunct, northern and Ozarkian plants as well. So the presence of this somewhat nondescript vine tells us something about maybe the history of plant distribution in the southern Appalachians. It's kind of a bit of a clue. Here's one of our many wild sunflowers. This one, Helianthus livigatus, is a rare one. They like sunny places, of course, tending more to the sort of acidic side, maybe a little bit of mix of both. There's many sorts of sunflowers in the southeast. North Carolina's probably got maybe 15 sorts, maybe more. Piedmont ragwort. It's an unfortunate name. That's a horrible name, isn't it? Ragwort. Pacra millefolium. It likes rock outcrops, these mafic rocks I've been mentioning that weather to basic soils. That may look like kind of just a neat place to hang out, but I assure you it was terrifying to get there. They like, I'm for real there. And it looks like it's like parsley, doesn't it? Or carrot, but it's not. It's in the aster family along with the sunflowers. But they like sort of cliffs and rock outcrops that are favored by, rattlesnakes and other, and I love rattlesnakes, and other cool plants that like sunny, situations in our region. And we have a lot of this sort of thing if you can kind of get to it. right? At risk to life and limb, occasionally. This is interesting. It's a wild mustard, bitter cress. Flowers early in the spring, April, maybe late March. There's a number of different sorts. And you may see from the name, I've got flagellifera, variety flagellifera, so there's other varieties. It's a food plant for orange-tipped butterflies, if you're familiar with butterflies, and West Virginia white butterflies. These are early spring sort of flying butterflies, and they favored the mustard family to lay their eggs on. Kind of like the cabbage whites that annoy your garden. They're country relatives of those. But these like seepy wet areas, like if you can imagine like mucky seepy areas where there are rhododendrons and maybe a bit of light, they like that. They like their feet really wet. Cuthbert's turtlehead. If you look at the side of this flower, you can perhaps see how it sort of resembles a turtlehead. Chelones, the genus, Chelonians, that's sort of the Latin term for turtles. There are 4 species of turtleheads in the world, and North Carolina has all of them, and Polk County has all of them. And that's the rarest one. And it prefers sphagnum bogs, the kind of places you might find carnivorous pitcher plants or sundews, that sort of thing. The picture here doesn't really do justice to the color, but you can get some idea of this. But I don't see this plant very often. I've probably seen it maybe a dozen times in my life, so it's a great find to see this. Here's another one of our orchids, small spreading Begonia. It's got a nice scent to it. It likes to grow in acidic areas. If you can imagine in your mind, imagine like it likes disturbance. A lot of orchids like disturbance. If there's fire or even turkeys sort of scratching at the ground, power line rights of way or telephone lines next to the road with things like blueberries and bracken ferns and pine oak heath, acidic stuff. Around Lake Adger, you can find this in places like that. It's a very beautiful flower, obviously. It's got like a single leaf that looks like a blade of grass, basically. If you don't see it in flower, you're totally not going to notice. But you can see what a great pollen guide right there on the labrum of that. Swamp pink orchid, another bog dweller. It likes to grow with things like Cuthbert's turtlehead, pitcher plants, and that sort of thing. I always like to talk about this because orchids, typically the lip is at the bottom, but if you notice here, it's at the top. And the way this particular genus of orchids works is it starts out at the bottom, and then as it develops, it kind of corkscrews up to the top. It's a little bit different, but it starts out at the bottom. Not very colorful compared to the last thing, is it? So this picture taken by Keith Bradley, an amazing botanist. His parents live in Tryon. But that's actually a very rare sedge, Carex radfordii. It's named after Al Radford, who was, for many decades, the leading botanist at Chapel Hill University. And this has a very limited distribution. So again, it's not a showy thing, but it tells a story about plant development in the Blue Ridge Escarpment region, because it's only found in our region and really nowhere else at all. Another sedge, photo by Keith Bradley. He likes the sedges. These are interesting plants. They are one of the largest, if not the largest, genus of vascular plants in our flora, Carex. This one's called Lupuliformis because the fruits there, the female fruits, I guess, are somewhat reminiscent of hops that you use to make beer. Each one of those prickly things is a female flower. And the structure of those flowers, the teeth, the shape, if there's sort of lines or nerves on that, that's how we delineate the species in this group. So you need to be really into it, nerdy, and have a 10 power microscope, or hand lens rather, because they all superficially look alike vegetatively. They look like grasses even though they're not. But that's a rare one. We found that along Hughes Creek, I think it was. Lobe spleenwort, so ferns, Asplenium pinnatifidum. This is pretty interesting because it's a hybrid of 2 other ferns. So in our region, this genus Asplenium, there's many species and many hybrids, and their chromosome numbers can vary widely between one another. Because plants can do weird stuff like, double their chromosome numbers in a generation. We can't do that, right? But they totally can. But there's a number of these that frequent rock outcrops, and some of them are quite dry. There'll be a little bit of moisture in the cracks there, as you can see. But the term for these kind of ferns is epipetric. Epi means on, petric means rock. These would be not easy to grow in the garden. You'd need the right kind of rocks, the right kind of everything else. But this is a hybrid. And if you're familiar with walking fern, you can see that's one of the parents if you look at how elongated these fronds are, these leaves. Yellow lady slipper, another species of the springtime, of course, and it likes rich woods. There's a couple of different varieties in our region. This is the common one. Botanists keep renaming the scientific names on this thing. It's irritating to me. But anyway, it's beautiful, whatever name you call it, right? If you see about 30 of these together, about 2.5, 3 feet high, you won't forget it. You shouldn't forget it. Here's a neat orchid, core root orchid. This one, again, they don't photosynthesize. And what's kind of cool about core roots, this genus, is you've got these open flowers here, but they also sometimes have closed flowers, and they can self-pollinate themselves. Violets do this underground, by the way. That's why they're hard to eradicate in your garden, because even when you mow them, they're seeding underground just to spite you, right? This is what violets do. But this is one of our rare ones. It's up in the early spring, so like March, April. It'll be done by now, probably. But this is one of those things that seems to be genuinely rare. And it likes rich soil too, mafic rocks. And it's scattered throughout our state. Doesn't jump out at you either. But I actually do think this is quite a rare one. So I was pleased to find this in the county, or rediscover it. Here's something that kind of looks like a beat up bunch of leaves, right? But you're familiar with Virginia creeper, most of you, the vine? Goes up trees and stuff, has suckers. Well, this one here, this was a new woody plant for our state. This is something you normally see in the Great Lakes region or New England and places like that, or even a little bit out west. Until this point, we found this on Round Mountain. The furthest south that was known in eastern North America was a site in Virginia, a couple 300 miles north of here. And so it was sort of on a peak, perhaps birds eat seeds, and then as they fly, they defecate as they go and perch. But if you look at this, there's a couple of things that are unique. It's kind of shiny. Can you see how shiny it is? Yeah, regular Virginia creeper isn't. And also, this doesn't have suction cups, so it's not climbing over anything. It's sort of scrambling over the ground. And I always tell this anecdote, but I sent a picture of it to a friend of mine, and he goes, "What's with the bug pea plant?" He thought bugs had peed all over it. And I was like, I didn't pee on it. Bugs didn't pee on it. It really is like that. And he was like, oh, wow. And so this was kind of a neat find for our state. We'd never discovered this in our state. It's not a rare plant in the world, but it's probably like our rarest woody vine for this minute, because I think there's only like 1 or 2 of them there. So that was kind of neat. Here's a Virginia marble seed. This is a plant that needs fire and basic soil, and wherever I find this, I find like 3 or 5 of them, and that's it. And I don't see them a lot. And again, it's not something that jumps out at you, but it's a very interesting plant whose presence is a clue to the fire history and the ecology of wherever you're at, because this thing really does need fire. Walter's wingstem, Verbicina walteri. So remember the sunflowers I showed you guys with the petals? This is also an aster, but it's what's known as a rayless aster. So the composites, or the aster family, they've got their disc flowers like that, and their ray flowers like the pretty petals we're used to seeing. These don't do the ray flowers. They just do the disc flowers. And in the background you can see an awesome patch of English ivy, which is a horrible invasive. And this is, I always tell this story, but this was a Polk County Most Wanted success story. So we wrote an article on this. This is one of our rarest asters in the state. It's got a really weird distribution. And when you see it, it's really neat. I mean, it's big, 3-4 feet tall and white. And wrote an article about it. It's like, Freeman had found it, Colross-Petey had found it, I couldn't find it. Got to be here somewhere. Wrote an article, got a call or an email from somebody. I think Pam took it. Went to this is the Bradleys, Keith Bradley's parents, Keith I mentioned earlier. Go to their house, and this is in the Tryon city limits. I'm walking around the back of the house. It's completely covered in English ivy. I'm like, I'm not going to see anything here. And it was growing out of that English ivy. There was like about 100 plants. And they just didn't care. So it just goes to show you that some plants I guess, are not as suppressed as others by invasive. We don't want to say that, but we would like to get rid of that English ivy, but apparently that particular rare plant is like whatever. So that's kind of good. I mean, it doesn't happen much, but this was a neat thing to sort of see those together. This is a picture I took with my phone that's not very good, but another rare composite or aster plant, this pink Thoreauwort, used to be in the genus Eupatorium, but again, we change it every 5 weeks just to annoy everybody. But the good thing about this picture is you can see the deltoid leaves that are really diagnostic, that distinguish this from kind of look-alike plants a little bit. And this is another one of those things that likes that kind of mafic soil. You'll find it in Alexander County, you find it here, just spotty distribution. So it was neat. You were there when I took that picture, Pam, I think. You were part of that. Here's a picture by Keith Bradley of a close-up of world horsebalm, Collinsonia verticillata. This is one of those plants that until recently was only known from Polk County in our state. It's an uncommon plant in the southeast where it's found, but I do believe that there's been some recent discoveries maybe in Rutherford County and possibly elsewhere, though sometimes misidentifications happen. But in Polk County, you sort of find this scattered around. You'll see like 5 here, 20 there. It is where it is, so to speak. But Polk County was its sort of place. It was one of our special things. It still is. Pale purple coneflower. Most of us are familiar with Echinacea as sort of a medicinal herbal thing for colds and whatnot. There's a number of different species. In North Carolina, this is probably the rarest one, although maybe not. It's definitely not common. You can see a good example there of the ray flowers, around the edges, the petals. These things have been found. There's historical specimens from McDowell County. There's a colony I know in Rutherford County nearby. And this is a plant that even when you try to grow it in your garden, if you don't give it just what it wants, it's going to die. And so anywhere this thing is found and it persists is a clue. So it's a prairie-ish kind of plant. I've seen it in Kentucky, and you see it in central Tennessee in the Midwest. And railway tracks or power lines, areas that have been maintained open for years, allow this thing to kind of continue because it needs lots of sunlight. And where this grows, there's also other prairie plants nearby, and it sort of, again, builds up a case. Because some people might say, well, it's just a garden waif, it's growing in a ditch. And sometimes that's very true. But in this case, I don't consider it to be true. I know in the Great Lakes region, some of the most important prairie refuge areas are railway lines that have been cut open since the 1800s. It's allowed these plants to maintain themselves. Because usually when a fire happens, the first thing we do is put it out, right? And we shot all the buffalo a long time ago. So all these plants that need lots of open areas, they're getting sort of shaded out. But the railway embankments allow them to persist. And so this was kind of a neat discovery. Deceptive spiny pod, Matellia decipiens. Related to milkweeds, if you were to break this, you would see latex, sappy, white sap. It's a vine. And there's a commoner vine called Matellia caroliniensis that looks very much like this vegetatively, but the flowers are different. These flowers are kind of bent back or reflexed. And this is another one that likes rich soils that are higher in sort of magnesium and calcium and that sort of thing. So you will never find this plant in a beat up, lousy area, like a railway embankment, for example. It would not like that. Big leaf grass of Parnassus. This is a tip of the hat to Donald Culross-Petey, because his specimen at Chapel Hill tipped me off where to find these. And this is actually not a grass, of course. It's in the saxifrage family, I believe, if you're familiar with that term. The saxifrages are an interesting group. There's a couple of species in the mountains. This one is rarer, Parnassia grandifolia. It likes rich soils. One of the common names for it to the west, I think, is lime sink grass of Parnassus. But when you see these flowering, it's usually maybe in September, early October, and they'll often occur with gentians and things like that. And they're just, it's like nature's last hurrah for the year, and they just go out with a bang. And if you see hundreds of these, it's one of the most beautiful displays you can see in our flora, in my opinion. Really neat plant.
How big are they?
The flowers may be about the size of a quarter. The leaves, which I've not focused on really, they're maybe a bit bigger, maybe like that. And they sort of come up on a stalk. Yes, sir.
If you look out, there's a cliff up there.
Uh-huh.
It grows on, one of those Parnassia grow on that cliff. I'm not sure which one.
Very cool. Yeah, there's Parnassia acerifolia that tends to like acidic seeps. And this one tends to like basic seeps. So maybe you and I need to go check it out. We'll figure out what it is. Any Parnassia is good. There's one at the coast called Parnassia caroliniana that's rare as well. But when you're kind of in the, and they like mucky, seepy areas, and if you're kind of in the gloom of all that, sometimes the flowers almost look like they're just sort of hovering like little butterflies, you know? They're really beautiful. This is one of my favorite flowers. Honestly, it is. Ozark bunch flower, Veratrum woodii. So this was, I've never seen it in flower in real life. Apparently they flower very sporadically, as the name suggests. Doesn't really have any business being in North Carolina, but here it is. Another clue. I think we found maybe about 25, 30 plants on a mountain slope. And I'd really like to see it flower. It's early July. I'll keep going back till it happens, but this is a rare plant wherever it is. You'll find it in like Illinois and places like that, but we have a site here in North Carolina. I think there's a site for it in South Carolina at Jocassee Gorges. You know, they just sort of barely made it this far east. And again, these populations, maybe they need fire as well, but they very infrequently flower.
What's their flower look like?
It's sort of like, I guess the botanical term we use is a raceme, like sort of imagine a stalk with a bunch of little flowers on it, and they're burgundy maroon with sort of yellow stamens. They're quite beautiful, whereas most veratrums are white flowered. Yeah. But maybe one day I'll have a picture for you, I'm afraid. Magnolia virginiana, Sweet May. So that grows not too far from where you're all sitting. Right? And as I always say, this is the reason we're here. I saw an old record of this here, and I thought I'd really like to see that because this is mostly a coastal plain plant. So I made a few calls and ended up making a really great friend out of it, Pam. So we kind of started this journey because of this actual plant, believe it or not. I was like, I'd really like to see where that's growing in Polk County. That's got no business being there. And it sort of intrigued me. And so that sort of started the journey that's literally brought me here to talk to you today. Because this is a plant, although not rare at the coast, what's it doing here? We're kind of far from the coast, but we have a lot of coastal plain disjuncts here. And so again, a beautiful magnolia. No such thing as an ugly magnolia, I guess, right? This is one Pam discovered, Georgia holly, Ilex longipes. You look at those leaves and you think, oh, those are kind of ugly, boring leaves, but that's a rare plant, so we're excited about it. And it's a deciduous holly, so it sheds its leaves every year, unlike sort of the more Christmassy hollies we're familiar with, like Ilex opaca. But Pam found this. It was a good find. I think it's known from maybe 6, 7 places in North Carolina. Again, it's more sort of from it's out of our district typically. Again, as the name suggests, Georgia holly, more common in Georgia. Poison sumac. Who wants to touch that, right? It's actually beautiful in the fall. If you've ever seen it, it's orange. It's beautiful. And this, again, is one of those things that's much commoner at the coast. But where this grows, for sure, there'll be cool stuff because it likes bogs. And botanists get excited about bogs because you'll find carnivorous plants like pitcher plants, sundews, orchids like this, bog turtles like this. And so you will find this patchily growing in McDowell, Polk, and Rutherford. And I've found new bogs by sort of in the fall, I'll kind of drive around and I'll see the orange of the plant across a field, and then I'll run across someone's field, and then I'll go say, well, there's a new bog there. I'll have to find out who owns this land and get real permission next time. But anyway, I didn't tell you that, but anyway, it's all good. But this plant is worse than poison ivy if you touch it. It's like the most toxic plant. You don't want to touch this plant. Nestronia. That's a pretty cool plant too. That's what we call a hemiparasite. So it's green, so it can photosynthesize some, but it needs a host. And excuse me, in this case, pines, I believe, are the typical host of this. And Nestronia is a rare plant for a couple of reasons. It's either a male plant or a female plant. This is a male plant. You hardly ever see female plants, unfortunately. So Nestronia doesn't reproduce, right? I think I've seen fruit once. And when it fruits, the fruit gets attacked by a fungus now. So the plant's having a hard time these days. And at nighttime, as dusk falls, Nestronia has a beautiful scent to it. And it's pollinated by micro moths, weird little moths that do their thing. And it looks like an opposite leaf blueberry. You could totally walk by it. I probably have. But this is a plant that's the only member of its genus in the world. And native people used to wear it around their neck. They believed it would bring good luck in hunting. Another name is conjurer's nut. I guess conjuring up whatever. But again, it's got neat little white flowers that smell nice, but in the vegetative state, it's nothing to write home about. It's about knee high. It looks like a blueberry with opposite leaves, but blueberries have alternate leaves. And it likes to be under pines and that sort of thing. So it's a rare shrub. Here's one of our specialties, white irisette. This is found in Rutherford, Burke County, Polk, I think Henderson, I think Greenville County, and maybe that's it, in the world. Another name for this is isothermal irisette, and its stronghold in the world is Polk County, like right where we're at. There's some right around here, and it's a beautiful little tiny white irisette. And it likes sort of basic soils and woods that don't have too heavy of a canopy. It likes a bit of light, a little bit of shade. If it's not flowering, you'll totally miss it. It just looks like grass. But this is a federally endangered plant. Large witch alder, Fothergilla major. This is done flowering for the year. Flowers come out before the leaves a little bit. Bottle brush is another name some people call it. In the nursery trade, there's a hybrid, I think, called Fothergilla Mount Airy. But this is the true species. This needs fire. This is a species that likes fire, has to have fire to do well over time. At South Mountain State Park, they had an area that had a little bit of Fothergilla, and they decided to do a prescribed burn, and they burned it big time. And I came back a couple years later, and there were hundreds of them. So the seeds are just waiting in the seed bank. It's related to witch hazel. If you look at the leaves, if you're familiar with witch hazel leaves, they're very similar. The fruits are nothing alike. The flowers are nothing alike, but the leaves are very much alike. Witch hazel is way more common than this. But this is a beautiful garden plant too. Climbing hydrangea, another Keith Bradley photo. This is a coastal plain plant typically, but in Polk County you can find it around in wetlands and sort of alluvial areas, riparian zones growing up trees. It's not in the genus hydrangea, but it's in that family. Very nice plant. Laurel catbrier, totally common at the coast. People at the coast hate this plant because it cuts them up when they're trying to go through places with machetes. But in our region, it's another one of these coastal plain disjunct plants typically. You'll find it in seeps, mucky areas, maybe at the bottom of a slope where water's discharging, maybe along a streamside flat. And again, when I see this, I get excited because I know almost for sure I'm going to see something else cool. It's a kind of a clue in our region. That's a bad picture of a rare plant, but I'm including it anyway because it's the only one I got. Hakelia virginiana, stick seed. This thing, it was always rare, but it's getting rarer, I think. I don't see this very often. It is nondescript, obviously, but its presence here is a good sign for the biodiversity of our county. It's a neat species to have. Again, it likes basic soils, mafic soils. It's related to Virginia marble seed. It's in that family. Again, it's quite a rare plant. Eastern shooting star, a great picture by Keith Bradley. Another sort of Midwestern prairie sort of plant that one finds on dry spurs around here, but sometimes also like seepage areas. I think in Tennessee they refer to them as rock houses. You get seepage and imagine some rocky ledges. This thing will grow there. It's got some large basal leaves and this nodding sort of beautiful white flower. And that is one of our rarer plants in North Carolina as well. This is a Polk County specialty. This is the only county that this plant's found in our state. It's Allegheny spurred, so I've focused in on the foliage. The flowers are very early, like late February, early March. This only grows along the Green River in North Carolina, It also occurs, I believe, in Greenville, South Carolina, and that's the only two places in the Carolinas it is. It's commoner in central Tennessee and limestone regions. But Polk County is the only place we know of for this plant as a native in our state. Likes basic soils again. You can see this pattern. I keep repeating that for a reason. But this seems to be a species that's naturally kind of going away on its own. The botanical term is senescent. It's sort of maybe in evolutionary terms, it doesn't seem to reproduce super great, and it doesn't spread very well, and its distribution suggests it's of ancient origin, but kind of receding out. But again, it makes a good garden plant, though. It's not that hard to grow. Dwarf flowered heartleaf, that's a federally threatened plant. There's many species in this genus, Hexastylus. They're sometimes called wild gingers. They're not gingers. They have these evergreen sort of heart-shaped leaves that are variegated. Without the flower, you can't be sure of the identification of some of these. And this particular one is, I guess, not the rarest, but one of the rarest. And the manner in which they're sort of distinguished from one another is sort of, how wide here is and sort of how deep. It's based on floral characters. And so comparing those to others, you can sort of identify them fairly readily. There's been a number of them discovered new to science recently. There was one just discovered a few years ago in Caldwell County, and it only grows along about 1,500 foot stretch of road that we know of. That's it. And these are popular plants with growers in Japan and Europe and places like that. I think North Carolina's maybe got 10 sorts, maybe, depending. Yellow honeysuckle, that's a nice one. It's another one that's commoner to the Ozarkian region. It likes rock outcrops, sunny slopes with mafic rocks, basic soils. Some of it grows not far from where we're sitting. It's my favorite honeysuckle, wild honeysuckle. I like it better than coral honeysuckle even. It's beautiful. Roundleaf serviceberry, rose family, Amelanchier. There's a number of species, some hybridize. This one is a rare one. Typically much commoner in the Great Lakes or to the north. It likes, again, rock outcrops, mafic outcrops. You can kind of see the resemblance there to crab apple or apple flowers maybe. They produce a little fruit. Up north they call this shad bush because it flowers when these fish called shad are spawning in the rivers. I think here sometimes it's called sarvisberry. It's sort of a derivation of serviceberry. So, time to transition to some animals for a minute. Timber rattlesnakes, we like them, right? But you got to be careful, they can kill you. Not often, but it's happened, right? Our timber rattlesnakes are kind of interesting because they tend to look more like the coastal plain variant, which some of you may know as canebrake rattlesnakes. And it's a lighter coloration. If you go up into the mountains like Watauga County, or if you go up to New York State or Wisconsin, which is the northern edge of the timber rattlesnake range, they tend to be black. And that's so they can absorb more sun because it's colder up there, compared to here. And so ours in Polk County, interestingly enough, again, are more similar to coastal plain variants, which tells us something about the biological history of our region. We have a lot of coastal plain plants and this sort of coloration on our rattlesnakes and the frequent rock outcrops for den sites. Rattlesnakes actually have a slow reproductive ecology. Females may breed only every 2 or 3 years. It takes a long time to reach sexual maturity. They don't have a lot of babies. So every time a rattlesnake is killed in a population, it's actually a pretty big hit on them. And so they should be protected and left alone. I mean, they can be dangerous, but if you leave them alone, they'll leave you alone. Bog turtles, our smallest turtle species, and a federally threatened / endangered species. These turtles are interesting for a number of reasons. They like bogs, as the name suggests, but they don't have to be in true bogs necessarily. They like mucky areas. They like their feet wet and their backs dry, I guess I've heard it said. They're popular in the pet trade. There's like a black market for them. I think they can go for a couple, $3,000 each for those who collect turtles. They are our smallest turtle, I believe, again. They have a neat distribution. They're found, I think, in very northern part of South Carolina. You got one population in Georgia, North Carolina, in the mountains, a bit of the Piedmont, Virginia, and then none in West Virginia. But their center of abundance is sort of New Jersey and Pennsylvania and stuff like that, but there's nowhere in between. But the populations up north are actually under greater threat than ours due to development and that sort of thing. But these turtles are very secretive, so the way you typically find them, unless you totally luck out, is you'll go in early spring or fall, and you take like a stick and you sort of just poke around until you hear like a thud, and then you put your hand down. And then you find them. And a good friend of mine named Dennis Herman, who's like a world authority on these, he took me out one day with my son to look for turtles in Ashe County. And it was one of the weirdest things as a biologist I've ever seen. This is a neat story, but it was like December 10th in the mountains. Now, do you consider that turtle hunting time? Because I don't. I do not. It was cold. And we parked somewhere, and it was on private property. We totally had permission because, you know, even to have these in your hand, you basically need a permit. And it looked like a field with a few alders, so I knew because alders like it wet, there'd be some water, but it looked nothing like what I thought it would. And we get in there, and it's a little bit wet, and then Dennis sort of puts his hand in this hole. And he's kind of doing, and the water's cold. I mean, it's so cold, like, you know how your hand hurts, it's so cold? Hey, like a couple, 3 minutes later, he pulls out a turtle. And I'm like, wow, what's going on? And he said, what they do is they hibernate at the base of these alders. And because the alders are also alive, in the winter, the alders are still undergoing a little bit of cellular respiration, so they're giving off just enough heat in the area of their roots so that the turtles won't freeze solid. How cool is that? And so then Dennis, he studied these for years, and he makes like little notches on their shells because it's a unique identifier. And he has like his little nerd book, right? And he said, oh, he goes, I first caught this turtle in 1991 or something. And he literally takes the measurements, has his database, you know, we're learning all these things about them. And it's just incredible. And within an hour, we'd found 9 of them like that. And it was like, I didn't know this guy, wouldn't even know about this at all. But, you know, I've seen a lot of neat things in biology as a field biologist, but that was one of the neatest, to pull turtles out of a hole near Christmas time in the mountains. And rare ones at that. So it was a really neat experience.
So that wasn't in Polk County, though?
No, we have them in Polk County as well. But I've not done that particular trick in Polk County. Now, in the Piedmont, I don't know about their sort of hibernation ecology here. In the mountains, most bog turtle habitats are very similar. They're sphagnum-dominated bogs. But in the Piedmont, no two sites are alike, except for one fact. They have to have cool groundwater discharge, because these turtles don't like it too hot. So in the heat of the summer, like July or August in the Piedmont, they'll estivate, if you know what that is. It's like a summer form of hibernation. They dive deep where it's cold, and they kind of literally chill out for a couple of months. And so in the Piedmont, it's got to be groundwater discharge, otherwise it's too hot, if that makes sense. Scarlet Kingsnake mimics venomous coral snakes. This is something you find in the eastern Piedmont and the coastal plain. We don't have coral snakes in Polk County, but we do have scarlet kingsnakes in Polk County, apparently. And herpetologists, people that study reptiles, are pretty interested in this because there's a lot of hybridization going on, a lot of variation going on. And I know Pam has had more experience with these snakes than I have, and she sent me some interesting photos, because in some parts of the state you'll see what looks like an integrate, like a hybrid between a quote-unquote regular milk snake and a scarlet king snake or what have you. You know, there's all kind of debate about this. But any of the photographs that Pam has sent me of these, I've sent them to specialists, and they concur that we have good, quote-unquote, scarlet king snakes here. And again, very odd, because we're not close to Raleigh here. We're not close to the coastal plain, really. But the snakes have been here. There's specimens of these going back to the 1930s from our region. So they've been here. This is an interesting thing. This is a fly. And you might say, well, that's cool. And it kind of looks like a bee, right? And when they zoom around, they really look like bees. And if you've read some of my articles, you'll know that I'm interested in insects that get into sort of mature deciduous trees, sap runs, and rot holes. This particular genus of flies, Calyceras, in Europe, a lot of them are endangered because they need old growth forests. And in Europe, of course, they don't have a lot of that left. So finding these kind of things in our region, which I did see some, is a good sign that our dead wood fauna of invertebrates is doing quite well. The term for that is saproxylic. That's the big SAT word, needing dead wood. But we're fortunate here that we still do have a lot of large trees. So when you see a tree maybe that's injured with a sap run or has a rot hole, that's actually a super important habitat for a lot of our rarest insects that don't get any attention because they're not butterflies and that sort of thing. And they have interesting life histories. They mimic the appearance of wasps and bees so that birds won't eat them and that sort of thing. And the larvae do really neat stuff. And of course, they're food in turn for other organisms, and they break down the rotting wood in different ways. And so I wanted to sort of include that picture so the next time you sort of see an insect buzzing around a dead tree that looks like a bumblebee or a wasp, especially if it's in early spring, I bet you it isn't. It's probably a fly. And then I'll quickly go through this. So, new species of yucca to science that we've discovered growing along floodplains in our region. Now, if you're familiar with yucca plants, they're more of a desert plant, like a cactus, right? Well, this particular species of yucca grows along river floodplains where it's underwater sometimes. That's really, really, really weird for a yucca to do that. And so as you can see here, Austin Creek, Polk County. There's the creek right there. This area completely floods. Now, if you were to find this once or twice, you might go, well, that's a one-off. It's kind of weird. Plants do whatever. But we see this pattern repeating in Catawba, Burke, McDowell, Rutherford, Polk, and that sort of thing. And nobody had really figured out that this was something unique. And here it is growing with dog hobble, which is something, that shrub there in the Ericaceae family, like the blueberry family. This is something that's you see growing at the toe of slopes in the mountains and Piedmont where it's damp by riverside. So to a botanist, that's a very weird picture. It's a very odd association. And then there it is with the creek behind it, and you can see that it's not a great picture, but I took it because you can see the alluvial deposits like the sand from flooding on it. Again, very, very odd. Right here, this is where the river was. This thing's growing right in the muck at the edge of the creek. Totally bizarre. And there were hundreds of them like this, right? Not just one or two. And this is a neat picture to me as well, because you see the ferns up here? You all know that ferns typically like it moist, right? But you see right behind them, that's the slope going up high and dry, and you see the little sunny patches? That's where the yuccas should want to be. But do you notice how they stop there? Like there's an invisible, invisible fencing for your dog or whatever? They didn't go up there. And yucca seeds blow all over the place. They're tiny. They should have been all up and down that whole place. That is a real smoking gun clue to me that this is not the normal yucca that we see on rock outcrops here. There's Dr. James Matthews from UNCC, and that gives you an idea of how large that is. It's a pretty large yucca. It's actually quite large when it's mature. And again, with a creek in the background. Very odd. There's Pam behind the camera and in front. So this is along the Green River, but can you all see how tall that flowering stalk is with the arrow? So when I gave this presentation to Rare Plant Conference in Chapel Hill, we actually came out with this actual flowering stalk because we cut it down later after it flowered or whatever. And you could literally hear the botanists go, the gasp, because it was like hitting the ceiling, right? And they're normally 4 to 5 feet. Like they were literally audible gasps, which of course pleased me. So I told them it was new, but Pam knows these are huge leaves. And that flowering stalk is ridiculous. It's like the Godzilla of yuccas or something, right? And the flowers are huge. I remember showing this picture to Alan Weekly, and he said, oh, that's a neat magnolia flower you got there. He was joking. But, if you ever wondered how do botanists kind of know what's different and what isn't from things that are similar, this is how we do it. There's some clues in the environment. There's Pam's arm. Those yucca leaves, some of them are over 3 feet long. It's huge. Huge. Dr. Matthews said, he goes, these are the biggest yuccas I've ever seen, and he's like 85 years old. And he's a proper professor of botany. And so again, there's some technical stuff in the writing, but I'm just giving it to you straight here. These are very large plants.
You have a question?
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't see too well.
When do they flower?
Hardly ever. And when they do, it's coming up, like early June. First, maybe end of May, early June. They flower at a different time. There's a little bit of overlap with the common yucca, but this one flowers later. And for a long time, it took us, I think we've seen this plant flower 3 times in 25 odd years if we look back to where they were when we didn't know they were new. And so very rarely do they flower. But late May, early June. So here's a comparison. On the left is the common flower of Yucca filamentosa, which is the ones you see growing in ditches by mailboxes or on rock outcrops. But do you see kind of the difference there? Do you see the broadness of the sepals and that sort of thing, the petals if you like? Here's another difference. Look at the peduncles. That's a fancy word for stem. The common one on the left, the mega one on the right. And of course, these were consistent throughout many plants. I'm just showing you individual plants for comparison. That's different, isn't it? And it may not be apparent to you all there in the back, but there's a kind of a fuzziness on this here. These are what we call eglandular hairs. They're hairy, but they don't have glands on them. And that one on the left is smooth. That one on the right is super hairy. And so as soon as we finally got our flowers, we knew it. It was different, but we had to wait because it took so long to find one that flowered. There's a difference as well in the width, again, you can see. And we take all these measurements, and when we publish this paper this year and give it a new name, that's what it'll be. And so finally, I'll shut up. So thanks to all these people, as you can see. But many thanks to Pam Torlina. She brought a copy of the Polk County inventory I wrote. It's a beautiful document because she made it look that nice. She edited it, she contributed to it, she made it look really good. So, and put a lot of science into it too. So if you ever see that, it's the reason it looks so awesome is because of her, not me. And so these are some of the folks that helped out. But special thank you also to landowners in the area, because without their assistance, the report would be like 1/2 the size or less. So that is all, unless there's any questions. Yes, oh, thank you. Thank you.